Hello and welcome to the webinar, How to Use the CalVTP Program EIR for CEQA Streamlining. This program is sponsored by the California Board of Forestry and Fire Protection. My name is Curtis Alling and I'm with Ascent Environmental, and I would like to begin our presentation with some introduction of the speakers. Matt Diaz is Executive Officer of the Board of Forestry and Fire Protection, our sponsor. My name is, again, Curtis Alling, Principal with Ascent Environmental, and I'm also speaking today are Heather Blair, Senior Environmental Project Manager with Ascent. She was the project manager for the CalVTP Program EIR. Lily Bostrom, Senior Environmental Planner with Ascent Environmental, and she was one of the key authors of the Program EIR. And then finally, Lara Rakovich, Senior Biologist with Ascent Environmental, and she led the biological investigations that were a part of the CalVTP Program EIR. Next slide. This slide shows the contents of the agenda for the day. We really appreciate the time that you're spending watching this webinar, and we're going to do our best to make it a valuable time spent for your CEQA practice. We'll begin with an overview of the CalVTP Program EIR, what it is, what is covered by it, and how to use it. We'll then talk about preparation of CEQA documentation for consistent projects that are later activities following the program EIR, including the project-specific analysis. Third part will be to discuss the decision process and the documentation needed to support that. And then the fourth will be the CalVTP program training resources. Our goals today are to help make the CalVTP process accessible to public agencies who need to expedite the approvals of their vegetation treatment programs to reduce wildfire risks for their communities. We are providing information that is technical in nature. This requires some knowledge of CEQA, but one of the purposes of the presentation is to inform in-house environmental planners and biologists, if your agency has those, so that the evaluations to streamline your projects can be done by in-house staff. You can add consultants, of course, but it's not necessary to do so. Also, the overall goal of the program is to assist all public agencies that have responsibilities for vegetation management to help increase the pace and scale of treatment to reduce wildfire risk, which is the overall goal of this program. I'll now turn it over to Heather Blair, who will begin our presentation about the CalVTP program EIR and how it addresses the vegetation projects it covers.
Let's begin with part one, overview of the CalVTP program EIR. As lead agency under the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, the Board of Forestry and Fire Protection certified the CalVTP program EIR and approved the program itself in December of 2019. 2020 began implementation of the program. It's currently being used by state and local agencies, and throughout 2020 and into 2021, we've seen its use continue to broaden and accelerate. The CalVTP program EIR is designed to help public agencies streamline CEQA review in order to expedite implementation of treatments that are consistent with the CalVTP to reduce wildfire risk and the harmful effects of wildfire on people, property, and natural resources in California. State and local public agencies with a discretionary approval, such as funding, permitting, implementation, or other approval, are required to comply with CEQA. Private entities, including private landowners and non-governmental organizations, they can prepare a project-specific analysis under the CalVTP program EIR for CEQA coverage of a treatment project, but the requirement for CEQA compliant rests with the public agency that has a discretionary approval for the project. And I'll revisit this again, but I just wanted to state it up front here because we receive a lot of questions about this. Who can use the CalVTP and who complies with CEQA? Again, it's the public agency that needs to comply with CEQA. Next slide, please. The CalVTP serves as the cornerstone of the vegetation management component in the state strategy to reduce wildfire risk. It's called out in the Forest Management Task Force's Wildfire and Forest Resilient Action Plan, which was released earlier this year in 2021, as a primary mechanism to facilitate the needed increase in the pace and scale of vegetation treatments. And as Californians, we know that this important work to mitigate wildfire risk while maintaining environmental protection can't happen soon enough. And this is underscored by the allocation of more than $1 billion for wildfire and forest resilience in the governor's budget, and the recent authorization of more than $500 million in early action funding ahead of the wildfire season. The increase in pace and scale of vegetation treatments has been mandated by Governor Brown's Executive Order B5218 and reinforced more recently by the shared stewardship agreement between the state and federal governments to treat 500,000 acres of non-federal land annually in California. And because this is a substantial increase from current and historic treatment acreages, regulatory streamlining relief is needed, and the CalVTP is intended to help with that. The CalVTP facilitates regulatory streamlining, and it holds in primacy the objective to improve ecosystem health and landscape resiliency while reducing fire risk. Next slide, please. So before we dive into the details of the CalVTP, I wanted to present a list of acronyms that we'll be frequently using throughout this training, and they're commonly associated with the CalVTP and its implementation. So I'm not going to read these, but I just want to note the naming convention for the Standard Project Requirements, or SPRs. They use the convention of SPR, resource name, and number. So for biological resources, it would be SPR Bio 1. There's a set of SPRs that apply broadly and are not associated directly with any environmental resource area. These in particular are called administrative SPRs, and their shorthand is AD. So for example, there's SPR AD1, and we'll be talking a lot about SPR AD7. Next slide, please. One of the determinations in determining whether a vegetation treatment project is within the scope of the CalVTP program EIR is whether the treatments would occur in what is called the treatable landscape. The treatable landscape is defined as the portion of the state responsibility area, or SRA, with vegetation conditions that are suitable for treatment. So the delineation of the treatable landscape was a desktop modeling exercise that was conducted by CAL FIRE's Fire Resource and Assessment Program, or FRAP. And so appropriate areas within which to implement vegetation treatments as part of the CalVTP were identified first by dividing the SRA into vegetation types using the California Wildlife Habitat Relationship System, or CWHR. This is managed by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. So certain CWHR vegetation types were then excluded because the wildfire risks within these vegetation types were negligible, such as wet meadow. And then agricultural CWHR vegetation types were also excluded from the treatable landscape. And so given this method, the treatable landscape, it's highly pixelated, and in some areas it really is quite the checkerboard. And so the checkerboard nature of the treatable landscape will be relevant in part 2 of this training when we discuss treatments that extend outside of the treatable landscape and that can still be covered by the CalVTP. So in total, the treatable landscape comprises 20.3 million acres in California. It includes tree, shrub, and grass fuel types. The Board of Forestry has a GIS-based treatable landscape viewer on its website, and it's linked here on the slide. Next slide, please. The CalVTP includes 3 treatment types that would be implemented within the treatable landscape. First, there's the wildland urban interface, or WUI, fuel reduction treatment type. This one is focused in WUI designated areas and generally consists of treatments to reduce fuel loads and slow or prevent the spread of fire between wildlands and structures and vice versa. The second treatment type is fuel breaks, and this includes both shaded and non-shaded fuel breaks. And third, there are ecological restoration projects. These generally occur outside the WUIs in areas that have departed from the natural fire regime as a result of fire exclusion. And this treatment type focuses on restoring ecosystem processes, conditions, and fire resiliency. So what I'd like to note here is that these treatment types are intended to be broadly encompassing and really encompass all kinds of different treatment projects. So evacuation support might be characterized as a shaded fuel break or potentially as a WUI treatment. You could have invasive plant removal, and that could be characterized as ecological restoration. So the program is broadly flexible in that regard. Next slide, please. There are 5 treatment activities that can be used in various combinations to implement the 3 treatment types. The CalVTP treatment activities are prescribed burning, manual vegetation treatment, mechanical vegetation treatment, prescribed herbivory, also called targeted grazing, and the targeted ground application of herbicides. So essentially, the CalVTP is a toolbox of vegetation treatment types and activities that could be selected by project proponents in various combinations in designing their treatments to reduce wildfire risk. So to be clear, not every treatment project needs to include every treatment activity. It could include 1, 2, or 3 different activities or all of them. It doesn't have to include all 3 treatment types. It could just focus on one treatment type, such as ecological restoration. The next slide, please. Standard project requirements, or SPRs, are another integral part of the program. They function to avoid and minimize impacts, and they emphasize effective compliance with applicable laws and regulations. For example, there are SPRs that require notifying the public in advance of treatment activities, such as for prescribed burning or in advance of herbicide application. SPRs that require preparation and implementation of a smoke management plan and burn plan to reduce smoke exposure. An SPR requires contacting the tribes prior to doing the treatments and working with them in designing the treatments to protect tribal cultural resources. So we'll be addressing SPRs in more detail in part 2 of this training. Some SPRs apply to all the treatments. Others apply only to certain treatment types or to certain treatment activities, such as SPRs that are specific to prescribed burning or specific to herbicide application. And these SPRs were developed in close coordination with regulatory agencies, including CDFW, the California Coastal Commission, the California Air Resources Board, and the State Water Resources Control Board. Next slide, please. The intent of this extensive agency coordination was to develop agency-vetted measures and a CEQA analysis that can be used to expedite the regulatory approvals for treatment projects under the CalVTP. So here are the primary regulatory approvals that the CalVTP was designed to provide CEQA coverage for. That is, if such approvals are required by the circumstances of the specific treatment project. Of course, not all treatment projects are going to warrant obtaining these approvals from responsible agencies. Next slide, please. So as will be covered in more detail in part 2 of this training, projects that are within the scope of the CalVTP program EIR are those that are consistent with the treatment types and activities that are described in the program EIR, that are within the treatable landscape, and that are consistent with the impacts that are analyzed in the program EIR. And so it follows that projects that are outside of the treatable landscape are outside of the scope of the program EIR. However, an addendum to the program EIR can be used to address these circumstances and still streamline CEQA. And we'll be addressing how to prepare an addendum in more detail in part 2. So as the CalVTP is for vegetation treatment, building code creation and enforcement and the like are not covered under the CalVTP. And also timber harvesting and other commercial activities that are subject to the Forest Practice Act rather than CEQA are not covered by the CalVTP. All right, next slide, please. As Curtis is going to cover in more detail in part 2 of this training, CEQA allows for use of a program EIR for a series of actions that are related to a continuing program, like the CalVTP. So one of the main functions of a program EIR is to facilitate streamlined CEQA review of site-specific later activities. And in this case, that would be vegetation treatment projects, so long as those activities are consistent with the program EIR. But what is unique about this program EIR is that it was deliberately designed for use by many agencies. The Board of Forestry is conducting this training to promote its use by many agencies, and it will take use by many agencies to reduce wildfire risk at the pace and scale that is needed. So the term that's used for an agency that could use the CalVTP program EIR is project proponent. And a project proponent is defined as a state or local public agency providing funding for vegetation treatment or with land ownership or land management or other regulatory responsibility in the treatable landscape. It is anticipated that CAL FIRE will be the most frequent user of the program EIR, given its major role in implementing vegetation treatment and as a grant funding source. Other possible project proponents include counties, cities, water agencies, special districts, open space districts, conservancies, large state land management agencies like CDFW, State Lands Commission, state parks, and there's more. There's the universities such as the CSU system and the UC system. And we've identified more than 150 different state and local agencies that could use this document for streamlining. So I'll note again, because this comes up often, that projects on private land can use the CalVTP if CEQA compliance is required for their implementation. So 95% of the treatable landscape is private land. Recall that CEQA compliance is needed if there is an approval needed by a state or local government agency. So if a fire safe council is seeking state grant funding, say from CAL FIRE or the Sierra Nevada Conservancy, the Fire Safe Council could prepare the PSA, which would be then adopted by the agency who is providing the funding to fulfill that agency's CEQA requirement. So now I'm going to turn it over to Curtis Alling to kick off part 2 of the training.
Now you've learned a bit about what the CalVTP is. We'd like to move to the topic of how to use it to streamline CEQA review for your qualifying fire fuel treatment projects. Next slide, please. The first thing we'd like to talk about is the CEQA process and the guidelines that are the foundation of the streamlining opportunity provided by CalVTP. And this uses the program EIR approach in CEQA. Next slide, please. If you're a CEQA practitioner, of course, you're familiar with program EIRs. They've been in use for a long time. The definition of them, their use, and the process for applying program EIRs to later activities consistent with the program in the environmental impact report are all in section 15168 of the CEQA guidelines. As it says there, the program EIR can be used for a series of actions that are categorized as one large project and are related geographically. So in our case, the treatment types, the 4 treatment types that Heather just explained, are the series of actions, are the type of activity that really constitute the vegetation treatment program. So that's the one large project. So the program EIR concept fits very well with this program. Now, the advantages of a program EIR are several. There's a comprehensive consideration of the cumulative impacts of
of vegetation treatment in habitats across the state. Since this is a statewide program, the program EIR serves to consider those cumulative impacts. Streamlining of projects that qualify as being consistent sufficiently with the program EIR to be called within the scope, that's the maximum approach to streamlining that can occur. The within the scope finding is protected by the substantial evidence standard. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And then even if a later activity doesn't qualify as being fully within the scope, the program EIR can be used to still streamline the process by focusing any follow-up environmental review to the topics that haven't been addressed, haven't been covered essentially in the program EIR. Next slide, please. Now, as I mentioned, the most streamlined process for qualifying later activity is the within the scope finding. The guidelines say this is a factual question, and the lead agency determines it based on substantial evidence. So what this creates is a benefit of using the substantial evidence legal standard if there are opponents who object to the approval of a later activity relying on the program EIR. Essentially, if a project proponent, the public agency, has substantial evidence to demonstrate that the project qualifies as within the scope, and they make that determination and there's an objection to that, as long as they have substantial evidence, the court should decide in favor of the public agency. So that's a strong benefit of this approach. This contrasts with preparing a negative declaration or mitigated negative declaration on an individual fuel treatment project, where if a project opponent raises a fair argument based on their own evidence that there may be a significant impact, then that opponent can force the public agency to prepare an EIR, or if the public agency chooses not to and faces a court challenge, then that's a much flimsier, much more thin ice as far as the decision going to the public agency. Now, the consideration of what is within the scope is shown in 15168 subsection C and 2. Now, these are originally written for more land development types activities. It says type of allowable land use, overall plan density and building intensity, geographic area, and covered infrastructure. So in its application to vegetation treatment, essentially what this means is the type of activity, similar to land use, you could think. The type of activity is consistent, so it's one of the treatment types that are described in the program EIR. The intensity of that activity is consistent with what's evaluated in the program EIR, and the geography is also consistent in the state responsibility area. Now, there may be circumstances where a project is outside of the state responsibility area, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The determination of within the scope is done with a written checklist according to the guidelines. And the guidelines really contemplate that a program EIR, well written, can be used for many later activities that are within the scope. Importantly, this has been validated in the appellate court in the court case Center for Biological Diversity versus Department of Fish and Wildlife. This program involved the fish stocking program of the department and its hatchery system. So there are over 1,000 lakes that were covered for fish stocking, and their entire statewide fish hatchery system was addressed in this program EIR, and it used standard project requirements to protect the environment, much like the CalVTP program EIR does, and this EIR was upheld by the court. So it really validates the stability and the usefulness of the program EIR approach. Next slide, please. The evidence that is prepared to demonstrate a project is within the scope is typically a tailored checklist. And I mean tailored by changing the column heads. You know, in the Appendix G checklist, environmental checklist, the column heads ask for things like whether it's no impact, less than significant impact, less than significant with mitigation, potentially significant. By changing the column heads to ask questions of whether an impact is covered in the program EIR and if mitigation measures have been assigned and so on, you can tailor that checklist to help support this decision. Now, as long as the impacts are covered in the program EIR, then you're able to get to the within the scope. If there's a new significant impact or one of the significant impacts identified in the program EIR becomes substantially more severe for some reason with the implementation of your later activity, then you may need to go to a different document depending on the circumstance, typically probably either a mitigated neg deck or an EIR that's focused on that topic. But I would say, and Heather mentioned this, that the program EIR for CalVTP was designed to be fully comprehensive in the topics that were addressed. So we think it'll be very rare that there's a new impact or substantially more severe impact. But if that comes up, then there's ways to address that. Okay, next slide, please. This flowchart shows the different pathways for a vegetation treatment program to use the CalVTP process, and want to just touch on each of those pathways in a bit. You can see that there's various levels of complexity, but they all start with the development of a planned project, and there are some process steps we'll talk about in terms of informing CAL FIRE at various stages. But what I want to call your attention to is if you follow the flowchart down to the third level, it says complete PSA. Depending on what the project-specific analysis, the checklist, says, then you have different choices. First, you can have all impacts covered within the scope of the PEIR, and that's the express lane to project approval, as you can see from this. One thing I do want to mention is that, and they'll be covering this a bit more as we go forward, but if there are certain change circumstances, like not all of the project is within the state responsibility area, some's in local, then there are ways to prepare a PSA that also has an addendum that is a part of that process, which also achieves the same streamlining because an addendum does not need to go out for public review. That's one of the main areas of saved time, is that using the PSA or a PSA addendum can go right to project approval with no need for an environmental document for public review. Now, if you do have a new impact, it can be handled in a few different ways, and Tracy, you can hit all three of the pathways there. If it's less than significant, there could be a negative declaration. If there's one that's potentially significant and can be mitigated to less than significance, then there could be mitigated neg deck. There's two pathways for that. And then finally, if you did find an impact that was new and significant and unavoidable, which again we think is going to be very rare, then you might have to prepare an EIR focused on that and get to approval. So hopefully that gives you a chance to understand some of the CEQA underpinnings of this process. This next slide here shows a comparison of some length and time data about different kinds of environmental documents that illustrate the streamlining value of the PSA or the addendum. As you know, EIR is most complicated, most time-consuming, can be 1,000 pages or over, requires typically a 45-day review period for most draft EIRs. The time for the whole process might be 12 to 18 months. If it's controversial or it's complex, it could go much longer than 18 months, but it is protected by the substantial evidence standard in the event there is opposition and litigation is filed against the EIR. The initial study mitigated neg deck, and neg deck is smaller. It's a little faster. Only a 30-day review is typical. 6 to 8 months is fairly common, but it is vulnerable to the fair argument standard, as I had mentioned previously. And then finally, the PSA, or the combination of a PSA and addendum, is shorter still. We found them to be in the 30 to 80 page range, and there is no document that is required for public review, so there's no public review period. It's been taking 2 to 4 months to prepare these, and as I mentioned before, it's protected by the substantial evidence standard. So we'll now move on to our next segment and turn it over to Lily Bostrom.
So now I'm going to talk about how to prepare a project-specific analysis, both generally, but using an example that we recently prepared as well. Next slide, please. So a key element of using the CalVTP is providing information to the public and other project proponents about the treatment projects being implemented under the CalVTP. Providing information is needed at 3 project stages, and that's in compliance with Standard Project Requirement Administrative 7, or SPR AD 7, and that's at the planned, approved, and completed project stages. Each stage requires that specific information be reported, and there is a specific purpose for providing information at each project stage. We will address each as we move through the PSA process in this training. So among the very first steps in preparing a project-specific analysis, or PSA, is providing information as early as possible in the project planning stage to the CalVTP implementation database per SPR AD7. The type of information you need to submit at this stage is listed on this slide. And the purpose at the plan stage is to inform the public in case interested parties would like to provide information on resources in the project area or region, and to be aware of the treatments that are planned. And I'd just like to emphasize again here that although it's not required, more public involvement is totally fine and can be very beneficial. Next slide, please. So this is just a screenshot of the CalVTP implementation database for planned projects. Each of the green dots represents a planned project. And if you click on one of the dots, a pop-out box appears as shown on the slide and provides some specific project information. Next slide, please. So one of the first steps in preparing your project-specific analysis is developing your vegetation treatment project information. And this is essentially your project description. So the type of information that's important to include are the CalVTP treatment types and activities that are proposed, the acreages associated with your proposed treatments, the fuel types they would be implemented within, and it's also good practice to include any ongoing or future treatment maintenance that is anticipated, as this will really extend the usefulness of your PSA well into the future. And other information that will be helpful in preparing your project description and project-specific analysis is including information about the types of equipment that will be used, the duration of activities, the size of treatment crews, things of that nature, because they will really help you down the road provide the evidence for your within the scope considerations. And the screenshot shown on the slide is taken from the project-specific analysis template that is available for your use. But if you'd prefer to prepare a more typical CEQA project description, you can do that instead. It's completely up to you. And one thing I'd like to note is that this template does have a question about whether your project is within the coastal zone. And if it is, then you do need to contact the local Coastal Commission district office to determine if your project area is within the jurisdiction of the local Coastal Commission, a local government with a certified local coastal program, or both per the requirements of SPR Administrative 9. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to walk through an example PSA that we recently prepared for the Mid-Peninsula Regional Open Space District. Next slide, please. So this project proposed to treat 214 acres within the Bear Creek Redwoods Open Space Preserve. The CalVTP treatment type that was proposed is ecological restoration, and the CalVTP treatment activities that would be used are manual and mechanical treatments. Ongoing treatment maintenance would occur every 5 to 10 years as needed using manual and mechanical treatment methods. And the non-contiguous treatment areas are shown in this figure on the slide. Next slide, please. So at the beginning of every environmental resource topic, there is this environmental checklist that you will need to fill out. It may look similar to an initial study if you've prepared one of those before, but we have tailored this specifically so that you can make your within the scope findings. And so the first column includes the specific impacts from the CalVTP program EIR. The second column identifies the significance of that impact from the program EIR, and the third column identifies the page number where the impact analysis for that impact is provided in the program EIR. So these columns will not change and are pre-populated in the PSA template that you will be using. What you do need to fill out is the columns to the right of the thick white line. So the first column asks whether your treatment project, whether this impact does apply. You then list any standard project requirements or mitigation measures from the CalVTP that are applicable to your specific project. You then identify the impact significance for your treatment project. You then indicate whether it would be a substantially more severe significant impact than was identified in the program EIR. And finally, you address whether the impact is within the scope of the program EIR. And in practice, I would recommend filling this out as you're developing your impact discussions because they do help to inform each other. Next slide. So impact discussions do follow the environmental checklist, and the impact determinations that you need to make as required by CEQA are a little bit different than your typical CEQA documents. What you need to do is determine whether the criteria for the preparation of a subsequent CEQA document apply. Those are contained within CEQA guidelines section 15162A. But what it really boils down to is whether there are any new or substantially more severe significant impacts. And your conclusions must be supported by substantial evidence. So you do this by including analytical discussions for your conclusions, identifying the portions of the program EIR that you relied upon, which are provided in the preceding checklist. You also want to attach any project-specific reports or site surveys that are conducted and any other information that you rely upon for your PSA preparation. And just be sure to include all of your references and have them available in case there is a public request to review those. Next slide. So impact discussions are required for each CalVTP impact. However, if one of the CalVTP impacts does not apply to your specific project, then that discussion can be very brief, just a sentence or two describing why that particular impact does not apply. For the CalVTP impacts that are applicable to your project, we've come up with a 5-step formula to craft your impact discussions. So the first step is to describe the impact of your proposed treatment project. You then want to summarize the impact in the CalVTP program EIR, identifying the section of the program EIR where it is addressed. You then want to provide the evidence that your project impact is indeed covered by the program EIR. You want to include any of the CalVTP standard project requirements or mitigation measures that are applicable to your project. And if you find that any mitigation measures are applicable but may be infeasible to implement, then you just want to describe the reasons why that particular measure is infeasible. And you want to be sure to explain how any standard project requirements or mitigation measures may be tailored specifically for your treatment project. And finally, the final step is to conclude with a statement regarding consistency with the program EIR. Next slide, please. So now we're going to walk through several impacts from the Bear Creek Redwoods project from the PSA that we prepared. So the first impact we're going to walk through is Air Quality Impact AQ1, which asks whether your treatment project would generate emissions of air pollutants and precursors during treatment activities that would exceed ambient air quality standards. So the first step of the 5-step process is to describe the impact of the proposed treatment project. So for Bear Creek Redwoods, that was the use of vehicles and equipment during vegetation treatments would result in emissions of criteria pollutants that could exceed the thresholds. Next slide. The next step is to summarize the impact in the CalVTP program EIR. So the potential for emissions of criteria pollutants to exceed the thresholds was examined in the program EIR. And the checklist, the preceding checklist does identify the specific page numbers where this impact is analyzed, so you can provide that as a cross-reference. Next slide. So then you want to provide the evidence that your project impact is addressed by the program EIR. So for Bear Creek Redwoods, that was that the emissions of criteria air pollutants as a result of vehicle and equipment use under the proposed project would be potentially significant and are within the scope of the program EIR because the size of crews, the types of equipment, and the duration of equipment use would be consistent with those analyzed in the program EIR. So that type of information, such as crew size, equipment type, is important to include in your project description because they're some of the factors that will help you make your within the scope determination. Next slide, please. So in this case, there were 2 standard project requirements that were applicable to this project, and 1 mitigation measure was applicable but found to be infeasible. And so the reasons why that particular measure was found to be infeasible were included in the PSA. Next slide, please. And finally, you want to conclude with a statement regarding consistency with the program EIR. So for Bear Creek, this impact would remain unavoidable and potentially significant for the same reasons as explained in the program EIR, but for the reasons explained above would not constitute a substantially more severe significant impact. So this particular impact was significant and unavoidable in both the CalVTP and for the Bear Creek Redwoods project. I will note, though, that in this case, we did not model emissions of criteria air pollutants. Instead, we relied upon the analysis and conclusions contained within the CalVTP program EIR. That's one of the streamlining benefits. But if you did want to try to show a less severe project impact, you could go ahead and model emissions and see if you come in below the thresholds. Next slide, please. So this is the completed checklist for impact AQ1. So again, the first 3 columns do not change. And the first column that we filled out was, does the impact apply to the treatment project? In this case, it did. There were 2 standard project requirements and 1 mitigation measure that were applicable to this treatment project. The impact significance for this particular project was significant and unavoidable. However, this would not be a substantially more severe significant impact than was identified in the program EIR, and this impact was found to be within the scope of the program EIR. Next slide, please. So this project did not include any prescribed burning, but many will. And so I wanted to note that there are some additional requirements for prescribed burning pursuant to standard project requirements, air quality 2, 3, 6, and others. And so you may need to prepare and submit a smoke management plan, create a burn plan, and implement an incident action plan, but we do recommend that you coordinate with your applicable air district to determine the specific requirements for prescribed burning in your jurisdiction. Next slide, please. So now we're going to walk through archaeological, historical, and tribal cultural resources. I do want to mention upfront that there are some cultural standard project requirements that require action to actually complete your PSA. So SPR Cul 1 requires that you conduct a cultural records search. You also need to contact the Native American Heritage Commission for a tribal contact list and a search of the Sacred Lands file. AB 52 was completed under the CalVTP program EIR and does not need to be reinitiated. However, standard project requirement Cultural 2 does require that you notify the tribes in the counties where your treatment is located, and that's to really gather any additional input on the potential for tribal cultural resources and to design treatments to avoid any known resources. And there are some additional cultural standard project requirements to be aware of for ground disturbing treatments and prescription burning. Next slide, please. So now we're going to walk through cultural resources impact, Cul 2. So that asks whether your project would cause a substantial adverse change in the significance of unique archaeological resources or subsurface historical resources. So the first step in the 5-step formula is to describe the impact of the proposed treatment project. So for Bear Creek Redwoods, that was that vegetation treatment activities would include mechanical treatments that use heavy equipment that could result in ground disturbance as vegetation is removed. And this could result in damage to known or unknown archaeological resources if present. Next slide, please. So next, you want to summarize the impact in the CalVTP program EIR. So the potential for these treatment activities to result in disturbance to, damage to, or destruction of archaeological resources was examined in the program EIR. And again, the preceding checklist identifies the specific page numbers where this impact is analyzed in the program EIR. Next slide. So then you provide the evidence that the project impact is addressed by the program EIR. So for Bear Creek Redwoods, this impact is within the scope of the program EIR because the treatment activities and the intensity of ground disturbance that would occur under the proposed project are consistent with those analyzed in the program EIR. So again, information about the treatment activities and treatment intensity are important to include in your project description as they will help you make your within the scope determination. Next slide, please. So in this case, there were 4 standard project requirements that were applicable to this project, and 1 mitigation measure was found to be applicable and also feasible to implement. Next slide, please. So finally, you want to conclude with a statement regarding consistency with the program EIR. So in this case, this impact of the proposed project is consistent with the program EIR and would not constitute a substantially more severe significant impact than what was covered in the program EIR. And in this case, the CalVTP concluded significant and unavoidable, but the project's impact was reduced to less than significant with mitigation. Next slide, please. So here is the completed checklist for Impact Col 2. So in this case, the impact did apply to the treatment project. The standard project requirements and mitigation measures that are applicable are listed. The impact significance for the treatment project was less than significant with mitigation. This did not constitute a substantially more severe significant impact, and the impact was found to be within the scope of the CalVTP program EIR. Next slide, please. So I just want to note that on a separate project-specific analysis and joint addendum we prepared, which we will be discussing later in this training, we did receive a response from a tribe from the outreach that was conducted under standard project requirement Cultural 2. And so as a result, SPR Cultural 6 was expanded to include project-specific implementation guidance that were specific measures that were developed in consultation with the tribe to protect tribal cultural resources. And that project-specific implementation guidance was then included in the project's mitigation, monitoring, and reporting program. Next slide, please. All right, so now we're going to walk through Impact Has 3, which asks whether a treatment project would expose the public or environment to significant hazards from disturbance to known hazardous materials sites. So in this case, the CalVTP concluded less than significant with mitigation. Mitigation measure Has 3 requires coordination with landowners regarding any known hazardous waste sites, a search of the Cortesia list, and if there are any known hazardous material sites within a treatment area, then they must be marked and no soil disturbing treatments or prescribed burning can occur within 100 feet. So in this case, there was a historic hazardous waste site known to Midpen, and so this does inform the impact discussion that we are about to walk through. Next slide, please. So the first step of the 5-step process is to describe the impact of the proposed treatment project. So for Bear Creek Redwoods, vegetation treatments would include soil disturbance through mechanical treatment activities, which could expose workers or the environment to hazardous materials if a contaminated site is present within a treatment area. Next slide, please. Next, you summarize the impact in the CalVTP program EIR. So the potential for treatment activities to encounter contamination that could expose workers or the environment to hazardous materials was examined in the program EIR. This impact was identified as potentially significant in the program EIR because of the large geographic extent of the treatable landscape, and hazardous material sites could be present within treatment sites, and soil disturbance in those areas could expose people or the environment to environmental hazards. Next slide, please. So then you provide the evidence that your project impact is addressed by the program EIR. So for Bear Creek Redwoods, as directed by Mitigation Measure Haz 3, a database search and review of the Cortesia list for hazardous materials sites was conducted, and there were no active Cortesia list hazardous materials sites located within or adjacent to the preserve. However, a historic era landfill was known to Mid-Penn to be located in close proximity to some of the treatment areas, and concentrations of certain pollutants have been found in excess of hazardous waste toxicity criteria. So consistent with the requirements of Mitigation Measure Haz 3, the landfill area would be marked or flagged, and no soil disturbing treatment activities would occur within 100 feet of the site boundaries. Next slide, please. In this case, only Mitigation Measure Haz 3 was applicable. There are additional standard project requirements that will apply to some projects, particularly if you are using any herbicides. Next slide, please. So then you conclude with your statement regarding consistency with the program EIR. So in this case, the impact of the proposed project is consistent with the program EIR and would not constitute a substantially more significant impact than what was covered in the program EIR. And so in this case, the impact was reduced to less than significant with mitigation for both the CalVTP program EIR and for the Bear Creek Redwoods project. Next slide, please. Again, here is the completed checklist for this impact. This impact did apply to this treatment project. There were no standard project requirements that were applicable in this case. There was one mitigation measure that was applicable. The impact was determined to be less than significant with mitigation, which would not constitute a substantially more significant impact than was identified in the program EIR. And so this impact was found to be within the scope of the program EIR. Next slide, please. So in this case, we did not need to look at the use of herbicides under this project, but many of your projects will likely propose the use of herbicides. And so 11 different herbicide compounds were evaluated in the CalVTP program EIR, which are supported by a compound-specific risk assessment. So if your project is proposing to use any of these 11 compounds, then they are covered by the program EIR. Just be aware that there are some standard project requirements that do apply to herbicide use for things like the avoidance and minimization of things like herbicide drift. And if other herbicides are proposed, then additional CEQA in the form of an addendum may be required, as well as a compound-specific risk assessment. So now I'm going to hand it over to Lara to talk about hydrology and water quality impacts.
Thanks, Lily. I will continue looking at impacts of the Bear Creek Redwoods project as well. And I'll first walk through the project-specific analysis impact for Impact Hydro 2, which is an impact on hydrology and water quality. This looks at whether a project would violate water quality standards or waste discharge requirements, substantially degrade surface or groundwater quality, or conflict with or obstruct the implementation of a water quality control plan through manual or mechanical treatment activities. So the first step in our process is to describe the impact of the proposed treatment project. In this case, the description states that vegetation treatment activities would include manual and mechanical treatment activities, and these treatment activities would disturb soils and require the use of fuels, which have the potential to enter waterways and degrade water quality. Next slide. The next step is then to summarize the impact from the PEIR. In this case, the summary of the impact is that the potential for mechanical and manual treatment activities to violate water quality regulations or degrade water quality was examined in the PEIR. Also, the checklist that precedes the impact discussion identifies the PEIR page number where the impact is analyzed. Next slide. The next step is to provide evidence that the project impact is covered by the program EIR. Here, the evidence is that the types and locations of the treatment activities and the use of equipment are consistent with those analyzed in the PEIR. Next slide. The next step in the impact analysis is to include the CalVTP SPRs and mitigation measures that are applicable to the proposed project. For this example, there are several SPRs that are applicable to the project. And they're listed here. They're all aimed at avoiding and minimizing erosion, sedimentation, and pollutants entering waters. Next slide, please. The last step of the impact discussion is to make a conclusion regarding consistency with the program EIR. In this case, the conclusion states that the impact is consistent with the PEIR and would not constitute a substantially more severe significant impact than what was covered in the program EIR. Next slide. Again, here's an example of the completed checklist for Hydrology 2, Hydro 2, similar to what you've seen before. The part on the left side does not change. The right-hand side here has been populated for this example for the Bear Creek Redwoods project. So yes, the impact does apply to the project. Here the applicable SPRs are listed. The impact is less than significant for the project. No, the impact is not more severe than identified. And yes, it is within the scope of the PEIR. Next slide. One additional point I wanted to mention related to hydrology and water quality is about compliance with applicable water quality regulations. SPR Hydro 1 requires that vegetation treatments conform to Regional Water Quality Control Board's waste discharge requirements or conditional waivers of waste discharge. Appendix Hydro 1 of the PEIR lists the current applicable WDRs and waivers for timber and vegetation treatment management activities. So you can look at that to see what may apply to your project. However, since the PEIR was published, the State Water Resources Control Board has started a process to develop a statewide water quality order for vegetation treatment activities aimed at streamlining permitting requirements. The proposed general order would provide coverage for projects that are within the scope of the CalVTP and have completed a project-specific analysis. No additional conditions or restrictions would be required. Projects would be automatically enrolled under the proposed general order through a notification process with the Board of Forestry, meaning project proponents would not need to separately notify the State Water Board. However, the proposed general order does defer to the regional board's waste discharge requirements that are currently in place. So the regional board may choose to use their adopted waiver or WDR until that expires. The comment period for this new draft general order closed in late April of 2021. So check the State Water Board's website for updates on the current status of this. Next slide. The next section of the training covers biological resources. The CalVTP PEIR includes an impact analysis and mitigation for a full spectrum of potential biological resources in the state, including over 300 special status wildlife species, over 1,000 special status plant species, and hundreds of sensitive natural communities. I'll describe the overall tiered mitigation framework here, and then I'll talk about each step in more detail as we move through the next few slides. The first step in the avoidance and mitigation strategy is to conduct a data review and a reconnaissance survey for the specific project as required by SPR Bio 1. If these, the review and the survey find that suitable habitat for sensitive resources occur, then the next step in the process would need to apply. In this next step, SPRs and mitigation measures require additional focused or protocol level surveys to detect or delineate biological resources, such as sensitive natural communities, wetlands, special status species, or nesting birds. If species or sensitive resources are identified during surveys, then the next step would apply. And this third step in this tiered process requires implementation of additional measures to avoid the loss of individuals or sensitive resources and to meet the performance standard of maintaining habitat function. If after implementation of SPRs, mitigation measures, and any feasible treatment design alternatives, the loss of resources or degradation of habitat function would occur and be considered significant under CEQA, then compensatory mitigation will be required. Next slide. SPR Bio 1 provides additional guidance for how to conduct the data review and reconnaissance survey. The results of the data review and reconnaissance survey should be included in the PSA in order to identify the baseline habitat and vegetation types and any potential sensitive resources in the treatment area. For the data review, the first step is to use the CalVTP PEIR to help narrow down potential resources that may occur within the treatment area. The PEIR biological resources environmental setting is geographically organized into ecologically similar regions known as ecoregions. So first determine the ecoregion where the treatment will occur. The map here on the slide is figure 3.6-1 of the program EIR and shows the different ecoregions and also provides the treatable landscape in yellow. The biological resources, environmental setting, and appendix Bio 1 of the program EIR identify the potential special status species and sensitive natural communities that may occur in each ecoregion. In addition to the ecoregion tables, databases, and other literature should be consulted to determine potential resources in the project area. For example, using CNDDB, CNPS, the California Native Plant Society's inventory of rare and endangered plants, using vegetation or wetland maps, species range information, local plans or policies, and any available survey data for the project area. For the reconnaissance level survey, a qualified biologist or qualified RPF should visit the site and assess habitat suitability for special status species and identify any sensitive resources, including riparian habitat, aquatic habitat, potential sensitive natural communities, and wildlife nursery sites. It is best practice to create a table containing the special status species that have potential to occur in the vicinity of the treatment area and include that in your PSA. In most cases, potential habitat for special status species and other sensitive resources will be identified in the project area and focused surveys will be required. However, in some cases, resources may be able to be clearly avoided. For example, by treatments being conducted outside of the common nesting bird season, or by making a project design refinement to fully avoid an aquatic resource. Next step. If SPR Bio 1 determines that suitable habitat is present or sensitive habitats may be present and cannot be avoided, then focused or protocol level surveys must be conducted as required by several of the SPRs and mitigation measures. The PEIR contains measures that require surveys for special status plants and wildlife, for common nesting birds, for sensitive natural communities, for ESHA if treatments occur in the coastal zone, and for wetlands. In some cases, presence of the resource may want to be assumed instead of conducting focused surveys. But then the required mitigation for that resource will need to be implemented as if the resource, such as a special status species, is present. Next slide. The third step in the overall avoidance and mitigation strategy is to avoid the loss of sensitive species and resources and maintain habitat function. However, if avoidance and maintenance of habitat function is not feasible, the tiered mitigation strategy provides an off-ramp for compensatory mitigation. To avoid loss, SPRs and mitigation measures contain requirements for physically or seasonally avoiding individuals, nests or dens, host plants, or sensitive habitat types, depending on which resource is being protected, while still meeting vegetation treatment objectives. For special status species, the tiered mitigation strategy provides measures based on the status of the species. For example, mitigation measure Bio 1A and mitigation measure Bio 2A are for plants and wildlife that are listed by the state or federal Endangered Species Act, or are fully protected by the California Fish and Game Code. And mitigation measure Bio 1B and mitigation measure Bio 2B are for special status species that are not listed or fully protected. The measures require agency consultation at certain points regarding resources that are under an agency's jurisdiction or in circumstances where a permit or approval may be required. The measures also allow for certain documented exceptions to avoidance. For example, mitigation measure Bio 1A and Bio 1B allow treatment that would benefit a special status plant species overall, even if individuals may be affected. Another example is SPR Bio 12, where exceptions are provided if it is not feasible to avoid loss of common bird nests while still meeting CalVTP program objectives. Next slide, please. The mitigation strategy also requires that treatments are designed to maintain habitat function for special status species and for sensitive habitats, such as chaparral and coastal sage scrub, sensitive natural communities, oak woodlands, riparian habitat, wetlands, and ESHA. Requirements for maintaining habitat function include retaining certain habitat features, for example, high canopy closure or tree snags, or conducting treatment to replicate the natural fire regime of the community. The qualified biologists, or RPF, will need to determine if habitat function remains for listed or fully protected species and consult with the appropriate agency about this determination. Again, there are certain exceptions permitted. The tiered mitigation strategy ends with the possibility of compensatory mitigation, which is required if significant effects remain after treatment, such as if significant loss of individuals or habitat occurs, or if habitat function is not maintained. For example, mitigation measure Bio 3A and Bio 3B provide a tiered strategy for sensitive natural communities, where mitigation measure Bio 3A requires that treatments in sensitive natural communities are designed and implemented to avoid significant impacts. But the measures also include requirements for compensatory mitigation if the avoidance measures are not feasible and significant impacts on the community would occur. Next slide. The CalVTP mitigation strategy was developed in close coordination with several resource agencies, including CDFW, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. As I mentioned, there are certain junctures in the mitigation strategy where agency consultation is required, and other points when consultation is suggested if the project proponent would like additional technical input. For these consultations, CDFW provided this map with the appropriate contacts in each region. So if consultation is needed, contact the people listed on the map and they will route you to the appropriate CDFW staff. Next slide. Now we'll walk through the Bear Creek Redwoods PSA for the biological resource analysis for impacts to special status plants and then to special status wildlife. First is impact Bio 1, which looks at whether a project would substantially affect special status plant species, either directly or through habitat modifications. As required by SPR Bio 1, we first conducted a data review and reconnaissance level survey for special status species in order to determine the species that could be affected by treatment implementation. We also conducted a reconnaissance survey to document sensitive resources and to assess the suitability of the habitat for special status species. Finally, we created a table of the special status plants determined to have potential to occur based on the database searches, the literature review, and reconnaissance survey. For Impact Bio 1, the description of the impact in the PSA states that initial and maintenance vegetation treatments could result in direct or indirect adverse effects on the 23 special status plant species with suitable habitat in the treatment area. Next slide. So back to our recipe, the next step is to summarize the impact on special status plants in the program EIR. Here, the PSA states that the potential for treatment activities to result in adverse effects on special status plants was examined in the PEIR, and the checklist that precedes the impact discussion identifies the page number where the impact is analyzed in the EIR. Next slide, please. The next step is to provide evidence that the project impact is covered by the PEIR. In this case, the evidence that the impact on special status plants is within the scope of the PEIR is that the affected species were covered in the PEIR and the treatment activities and intensity of disturbance are consistent with those analyzed in the EIR as described in the project description. Next slide. The next step is to include the SPRs and mitigation measures from the CalVTP that are applicable to the proposed project. For the Bear Creek Redwoods example, there are several SPRs that are applicable to the project regarding avoidance of suitable habitat where feasible, biological resources training for workers, surveys for special status plants, and several others. If special status plants are detected, mitigation measure Bio 1A for listed species and Bio 1B for non-listed special status plants would be required, and a no disturbance buffer of at least 50 feet would be implemented unless it is determined that the plant would benefit from treatments in occupied habitat, even though some individual plants may be lost. In this example, the project proponent did determine that treatment would benefit an existing population of Hickman's popcorn flower, a non-listed special status plant. The PSA includes substantial evidence that implementation would be beneficial and cites scientific studies demonstrating that the species has benefited from increased sunlight and water due to increased canopy opening and reduced competition. Next slide. The last step of the impact discussion is to make a conclusion regarding consistency with the PEIR. In this case, the conclusion states that the impact is consistent with the PEIR and would not constitute a substantially more severe significant impact than what was covered in the PEIR. Next step. This is the completed checklist for Impact Bio 1. On the left side of the table is the part that does not change. And on the right side is the project-specific checklist populated for the Bear Creek Redwoods project. Here, if you follow along, yes, the impact applies to the project. The applicable SPRs and mitigation measures are listed. The impact is the same for the project as for the PEIR, which is less than significant with mitigation. No, the impact is not more severe than identified in the PEIR, and yes, it is within the scope. Next slide. Now we'll walk through the Impact Bio 2 for the Bear Creek Redwoods PSA, which looks at whether a project would substantially affect special status wildlife species. We first completed a list of special status wildlife species that could occur in the treatment area by reviewing databases such as the CNDDB, looking at previous survey reports, and looking at Appendix Bio 3 from the PEIR for the Central California Coast ecoregion. As I mentioned for plants, Similarly here, we conducted a reconnaissance level survey to assess the suitability of the habitat for special status wildlife. And finally, we created a species table containing 21 special status wildlife species that we determined have potential to occur based on the data review and the reconnaissance level survey. The description of the impact of the proposed treatment in the PSA states that initial and maintenance vegetation treatments could result in direct or indirect adverse effects on special status wildlife species with suitable habitat within the treatment area. Next slide. The next step in our recipe is to summarize the impact on special status wildlife in the PEIR. Here, the PSA states that the potential for treatment activities, including maintenance treatments, to result in adverse effects on special status wildlife was examined in the PEIR. The PEIR organized special status wildlife by grouping them into life history categories that respond similarly to the range of treatment activities. And the life history categories are listed here on the slide in the green box. It was assumed that life history traits such as breeding ecology and preferred habitat predict potential impact mechanisms. For example, loss of trees or cavity habitat as a result of treatment activities would likely result in similar impacts for all tree nesting and cavity nesting species, including tree nesting birds, as well as some mammals such as fisher or ringtail. In our example project, mountain lion is known to occur in the Bear Creek Redwoods Preserve and recently became a candidate for listing on the California Endangered Species Act. Although mountain lion was not included in the list of special status species in the PEIR because at the time it was written in 2019, it did not meet the criteria for special status. However, adverse effects to mountain lion were examined in the PEIR in the burrowing or denning wildlife species category. The next step, next slide, is to provide evidence that the project impact is covered by the program EIR. In this case, the evidence that the impacts on special status wildlife is within the scope of the PEIR is that the affected species were covered in the PEIR and the treatment activities and intensity of disturbance are consistent with those analyzed in the PEIR. Next slide. The next step in the impact analysis is to include the SPRs and mitigation measures from the CalVTP that are applicable to the proposed project. For the Bear Creek Redwoods example, there are several SPRs that are applicable, such as avoiding nesting season, implementing no disturbance buffers along perennial streams, conducting additional surveys for special status wildlife, and a few others. If special status wildlife are observed, mitigation measure Bio 2A for listed and fully protected species and Bio 2B for non-listed special status wildlife species would be required. The PSA discusses each wildlife species or group of species, such as special status birds or special status bats, that are likely to occur, and the PSA lays out the surveys that will be required for each of these species or group of species. The PSA also describes the project-specific measures that will be required if species are present, such as no disturbance buffers, monitoring, and consultation with agencies. For this project, mitigation measure Bio 2A required MidPen to determine if treatments would maintain habitat function for mountain lion and consult with CDFW regarding their determination. MidPen determined that habitat function would be maintained because habitat connectivity for mountain lions would be maintained due to the patchy nature of the treatment areas and primarily only invasive non-native vegetation and areas affected by sudden oak death would be removed. The PSA documented this evidence for the determination that habitat function would be maintained, and MidPen discussed this determination with CDFW. If a project proponent determines that habitat function would not be maintained, then compensatory mitigation will be required. Next slide. The last step of the impact discussion is to make a conclusion regarding consistency with the PEIR. In this case, the conclusion states that the impact on special status wildlife is consistent with the PEIR and would not constitute a substantially more severe significant impact than what was covered in the PEIR. This conclusion was stated for each species or group of species in the PSA analysis. Next slide. And again, here's the completed checklist. This is for Impact Bio 2. The left side includes the part that does not change. It describes the impact significance in the PEIR. I just want to note that that is less than significant with mitigation for all species except special status bumblebees, which is considered significant and unavoidable by the PEIR. On the right-hand side is the project-specific checklist populated for the Bear Creek Redwoods project. So following along here, yes, the impact does apply to the project. The applicable SPRs and mitigation measures are listed. The impact is the same for the project as for the PEIR, which is less than significant with mitigation. No, the impact is not more severe than identified in the PEIR. And yes, it is within the scope. Next slide. Okay, now I'm going to hand this off to Heather.
Thank you, Lara. So how can I use the CalVTP program EIR if my project extends outside of the treatable landscape? We get this question a lot, and understandably, because the treatable landscape is a product of the desktop model, and it's highly pixelated. So the design of treatment projects on the ground does not necessarily adhere to the boundaries of the state responsibility area or local responsibility area, for instance. The use of an addendum to the CalVTP program EIR can address this circumstance if the landscape conditions and environmental conditions are substantially similar both within and outside of the treatable landscape. So pursuant to CEQA, an addendum to an EIR is appropriate when a project or a circumstance have changed since the EIR was certified and there are no new or substantially more severe significant environmental impacts than were analyzed in that EIR. So using an example of a project that extends outside of the treatable landscape, this extension of the geographic scope of the EIR would be that change to the program that would warrant preparation of an addendum. Next slide, please. But don't worry, preparing an addendum is as simple as preparing a PSA. They can be combined into the same document, which is called a PSA/addendum to the program EIR. So again, it's combined into the same document. An addendum is not an appendix to a PSA. Just wanted to clarify that up front. And that is because, essentially you're asking the same questions in an addendum as you would in a PSA. That is, are there any new or substantially more severe significant impacts than were analyzed in the program EIR? The difference between an addendum and a PSA is the addendum is addressing some change to the program, the primary example being the extension outside of the treatable landscape. The schedule for preparing a PSA/addendum is the same as for preparing a PSA. And like a PSA, no public review is required for an addendum. The checklist is the same. Again, you're asking the same questions to determine if there are any new or substantially more severe significant impacts. And both an addendum and a PSA are subject to the same substantial evidence standard of review in court. In comparison to a PSA, though, the decision documentation for a PSA/addendum requires some additional nuanced language for CEQA compliance. One of the two projects used for this training is the Grouse Ridge Vegetation Treatment Project, which was completed under the CalVTP using a PSA/addendum. So all of the documents associated with that project, including the PSA addendum and the decision documentation, are available on the CalVTP website. Next slide, please. The Grouse Ridge Research Forest is located in Nevada County and was acquired by Berkeley Forest in 2016. The area has a history of timber harvesting, wildfire, and recent regeneration, and is primarily used for research by UC Berkeley. So approximately 406 acres of the 1,134 acre treatment area extended outside of the CalVTP treatable landscape. The treatment areas that are outside of the treatable landscape are dispersed in small sections of the treatment areas as shown on the map on this slide. Next slide, please. UC Berkeley was applying for a CCI forest health grant from CAL FIRE, and their project was of interest to the board for use in this training because it proposed a wide variety of different treatment types. I've heard it referred to as the kitchen sink of treatments. And this in part is because of its purpose as a research forest. You know, they're looking to see, you know, how the landscape responds to different treatments. So generally, these treatments fell into the fuel break and the ecological restoration treatment types for the CalVTP. Next slide. So in comparison to the within the scope findings that are documented using a PSA, an addendum should also include a differentiation of the treatment areas that are within and outside of the treatable landscape. This could be done on a map, which I showed in the previous slide, as well as identifying the acreage that is within and the acreage that is outside of the treatable landscape. The impact discussion should describe how the impact was covered under the program EIR, and importantly, why the areas outside of the treatable landscape do not trigger CEQA requirements for subsequent review under CEQA guideline section 15162. So essentially all this is to document that the treatment areas outside of the treatable landscape, like the areas within the treatable landscape, do not result in any new or substantially more severe significant impacts. Next slide, please. Here is example text from the Grouse Ridge PSA/addendum used to document why the areas outside of the treatable landscape would not trigger subsequent review. This impact is specific to aesthetics here. And the rationale is that the scenic resources are the same in the areas within and outside of the treatable landscape. So the evidence that's presented for this impact within the treatable landscape to substantiate that there would be no new or substantially more severe significant impact, that evidence also applies to the areas that are outside of the treatable landscape. Next slide, please. And this slide presents additional text for documenting this conclusion. Next slide. So finally, the impact analysis should summarize the impacts that result from the treatment areas both within and outside the treatable landscape. Again, with the intent to substantiate that the inclusion of the areas outside of the treatable landscape are consistent with those analyzed in the CalVTP program EIR and would not result in any new or substantially more severe significant impact. Next slide. And so now we're going to discuss how to use the CalVTP to streamline CEQA if, in fact, a new or substantially more severe significant impact is identified. It's not likely, but it's possible. All right, next slide. So if such an impact is identified, that impact is not within the scope of the CalVTP program EIR, and it must be addressed in either a negative declaration, mitigated negative declaration, or EIR. So in this case, where an impact is outside of the scope of the CalVTP because it is new or it is a substantially more severe significant impact, the PSA can function as an initial study to document all the impacts that are within the scope of the program EIR and evaluate those impacts that are not within the scope to support preparation of a negative declaration, MND, or EIR that is focused solely on that impact or those impacts that are not within the scope of the program EIR. All right, next slide. For the new or substantially more severe significant impact that is outside of the scope of the program EIR, the type of focused CEQA document that need be prepared, that is a negative declaration, MND or EIR, will depend on the severity of the impact pursuant to the requirements of CEQA. The triggers for preparation of these various types of CEQA documents are shown on the flow chart of this slide. So all this being said, we expect the need to prepare a separate CEQA document for vegetation treatment projects would be exceedingly rare. The program EIR was designed to be very comprehensive. We sat around the table with CAL FIRE to brainstorm all reasonably foreseeable impacts that could occur during vegetation treatment so that we could maximize the use of within the scope findings. So it's difficult to think of a new impact for vegetation treatment that wasn't contemplated in the EIR. And we structured the analysis to account for the most severe reasonably foreseeable impacts, calling those potentially significant and unavoidable. All right, next slide. Great, on to part 3, decision, documentation, and approval process. Next slide. The final part of this training is going to focus on the steps to follow for decision documentation and project approval, including adopting the PSA, the Mitigation Monitoring and Reporting Program, or MMRP, and the CEQA findings, approving the project, filing the Notice of Determination, or NOD, and submitting information for the CalVTP implementation database pursuant to SPR AD7. All right, next slide. A project-specific MMRP needs to be prepared for each later vegetation treatment project and adopted by the project proponent agency. So start by using the comprehensive program MMRP that was prepared for the CalVTP program EIR, and adapt that program MMRP to the specifics of your vegetation treatment project. The program MMRP is available on the How to Implement the CalVTP webpage. So in preparing your project-specific MMRP, you can remove the measures that are not applicable to your project. You do not need to address SPRs and mitigation measures that don't apply to your treatment project. And for the measures that are applicable to your project, document whether the SPR is applicable to the initial treatment and the maintenance treatment or the maintenance treatment. And this can be done by a simple yes or no answer. As required by CEQA, the MMRP needs to identify the timing for implementation of the measure, as well as identification of the implementing entity and the monitoring or verification entity. So typical examples of timing might be prior to the treatment or during the treatment. The entry in this column of the MMRP is from the CalVTP program EIR and shouldn't need to change for the specifics of your project. The implementing entity is the agency or organization responsible for carrying out the measure. So this could include the project proponent's project manager, a technical specialist, such as a qualified archaeologist or biologist, a vegetation management contractor or partner agency, or other entity. The verifying or monitoring entity is the agency or organization that's responsible for ensuring that the requirement is implemented. That verifying and monitoring entity may be different from the implementing entity, but it's typically the agency that's preparing the PSA or other CEQA document using the CalVTP. So in some cases, it's helpful to add project-specific implementation guidance, which tailors the measure to the specifics of a treatment project, such that someone could take that MMRP into the field and know exactly what to do for each measure. Project-specific implementation guidance will likely be most frequently used for biological resource measures. Next slide. So this slide shows an example SPR from the MMRP for the Bear Creek Redwoods Open Space Preserve Vegetation Treatment Project. Project-specific implementation information was included for SPR Bio 10. This SPR in the program EIR requires surveys for special status wildlife. The project-specific implementation information includes focused survey requirements and buffers for the specific special status species that are known to occur in the area and could be affected by the treatments. So Lara is going to be going into more detail on MMRP implementation later in part 3. Okay, next slide. An agency must also adopt its own project-specific CEQA findings in any case, and a statement of overriding considerations if there are significant and unavoidable impacts. This is pursuant to CEQA Guidelines Section 15091. The template for these project-specific findings and statement of overriding considerations is available on the How to Implement the CalVTP webpage, and those can be adapted for your specific project. Next slide, please. The findings template includes detailed instruction for users. As required by CEQA, findings need to be made for impacts that are less than significant with mitigation and those that are significant and unavoidable. The template here also addresses impacts that are less than significant. The findings section of the template is pre-populated with the CalVTP impact conclusions. But for your project, you would check the box next to the impacts that apply at each significance level and delete the others from the findings document if they don't apply, so that you can tailor the findings to the specifics of your vegetation treatment project. You could also move impacts around if need be. So for example, as shown in the excerpt on the slide, impact bio 1 was determined to be less than significant with mitigation in the program EIR. But if for your project, impact bio 1 is less than significant and does not require mitigation, as substantiated in the PSA, then you would cut and paste it under the findings for impacts that are less than significant. You can move the impacts around to put them in the under the right heading for the significance determination. Also, the record of proceedings needs to include the certified final program EIR for the CalVTP, the findings that were adopted by the board in connection with the CalVTP, and all the documents that are related to the specific vegetation treatment project, which are typically those that are cited in the PSA. And pursuant to CEQA Guidelines Section 15092, Subdivision E, the documents constituting the record of proceedings must be available for public review, either in hard copy at a public location or online, and how to access the record needs to be described in the findings. All right, next slide, please. So next we're going to go over the agency decision-making process. And CEQA Guidelines Section 15092 addresses CEQA's requirements for project approval. It states that after considering the final EIR and in conjunction with making the findings under Section 15091, which we just described, the lead agency may decide whether and how to approve or carry out the project. It goes on to explain that the public agency shall not decide to approve or carry out a project unless either the project will not have any significant effects or the agency has eliminated or lessened all significant effects where feasible, as shown in the findings, and determine that any remaining significant effects are acceptable because of overriding considerations. And that's documented in the statement of overriding considerations. So other than adhering to those CEQA requirements, the project approval process is completely agency specific. So I'd like to note that there are no approvals or anything from CAL FIRE that's required if CAL FIRE isn't the lead agency or have some other project related approval. So we get that question a lot. Agencies can use the CalVTP without CAL FIRE involvement, unless CAL FIRE has an approval. Like I said, just because it's the CalVTP, it doesn't automatically require something from CAL FIRE or the Board of Forestry. So the MMRP and findings and the statement of overriding consideration need to be adopted pursuant to CEQA. However, the PSA does not require formal adoption. But if an addendum is prepared, if it's a PSA addendum, then that does need to be adopted. And within 5 days of project approval, you must file a notice of determination, or NOD, with the state clearinghouse and possibly with the county clerk of the county within which your project is located if you are a local agency. So for the 2 example projects that we've used in this training, we adapted the notice of determination form from Appendix D of CEQA guidelines to better address the approvals and information for a within the scope finding or an addendum to a program EIR. And these are available on the CalVTP webpage for your use. The CDFW CEQA filing fees were paid for with the NOD for the CalVTP program EIR. So there is no need to pay CDFW filing fees again for PSAs or PSA addendum. The receipt that you would submit with the notice of determination as proof of payment is on the CalVTP website. So please include that CDFW receipt for the program EIR with the NOD for your specific vegetation treatment project. And pursuant to SPR AD7, you need to submit information for the approved project to the Board of Forestry, including the PSA and the MMRP, as well as certain GIS data. So refer to the CalVTP website for specific direction on the submittal. There is a user instruction for submitting data on the CalVTP webpage. Also, as kind of a side note, your agency may decide to designate a single point of contact for submitting information to the Board of Forestry. So if you have a lot of PSAs going on, you may just designate one person that's sort of the clearinghouse for submittal to the board. And for instance, Shannon Johnson is the single point of contact for CAL FIRE to submit information on approved and implemented projects. So that's Shannon Johnson. Next slide, please. Here's another screenshot of the CalVTP implementation database for approved projects. The information shown is for the Grouse Ridge Vegetation Treatment Project. And if you clicked on the more info link that's being shown by that mouse there, thanks, you can see it will take you to the completed environmental documents page, which includes the final PSA and the MMRP. So again, for the 2 example documents, for the 2 example projects, all of the decision documentation, including the MMRP, the findings and statement of overriding consideration, the notice of determination, and the SPR AD7 compliance information is presented on the CalVTP website under example PSA documents and webinar training. So please take a look at those, and we hope that they're helpful. So now I'm going to turn it back to Lara to explain MMRP implementation.
All right, thanks, Heather. All right, next slide, please. So MMRP implementation. CEQA requires 2 things related to the MMRP implementation: that mitigation measures are implemented, and in order to ensure that they're implemented, that the lead agency adopts a program for monitoring or reporting on the mitigation measures. And this is really where CEQA's requirements end. CEQA does not specify what the adopted program should look like, and even specifically says that the lead agency may choose whether its program will monitor mitigation, will report on mitigation, or do both. CEQA itself has no sanctions built in for a situation where a required mitigation measure is not implemented. Enforcement is up to the lead agency approving the project, or perhaps an agency with another regulatory connection if it is required, such as a lake and stream bed alteration agreement by CDFW. Best practice is to retain documentation for proof that mitigation has been implemented. Specific to the CalVTP, SPR AD7 requires that certain information is submitted to the board and CAL FIRE when the project is completed. This is called the post-project implementation report. Along with GIS files and other treatment activity data, SPR AD7 requires a list of all the SPRs and mitigation measures that were implemented and any required explanations regarding implementation. Knowing this reporting requirement, one suggestion is to add a couple columns to the MMRP that is created for the PSA to turn it into an implementation guidance document that can later serve as the post-project implementation report. Next slide, please. Here's an example of the implementation guidance document for a project PSA/addendum that we worked on called the Yuba Foothills Healthy Forest Project. And this will later be submitted as the post-project report. This guidance table distills down the essential elements from the MMRP. It provides project-specific guidance and helps keep track of which SPRs and mitigation measures are implemented. The Yuba Foothills project encompasses multiple landowners, and each landowner plans to conduct a different combination of treatment activities, and their land contains different biological resources. Therefore, not all the SPRs and mitigation measures in the MMRP apply to each landowner. So we prepared this implementation guidance table for each landowner, and it includes the SPRs and mitigation measures that are specific to their land and their project activities. You can see here that the table includes the name of the measure, the timing and treatment activities, which are all from the MMRP. And then we added a project-specific implementation guidance column and implementation reporting column. In this table excerpt, the first row is for SPR Bio 1, which includes the data review and reconnaissance level survey. The results of the data review and recon survey will be included in the PSA. So this one can be checked as implemented. The next row is for special status plant surveys and includes specific information for where the survey should occur and which species may occur during in the treatment area. Next slide, please. So here are a couple more examples from the implementation guidance table. SPR AD4 contains requirements related to public notification for prescribed burning. So the guidance helps with implementation by providing the specific agencies that need to be notified. In this case, the Grass Valley CAL FIRE Command Center and the local volunteer fire department. The next row is for SPR AQ2, Air Quality 2, which requires the submittal of a smoke management plan in accordance with local regulations. Now, each applicable air district or districts with jurisdiction over a treatment area may have unique requirements for smoke management and burn plans. So you may contact the district's burn coordinator to determine project-specific requirements for smoke management and burn plans. In this case, the project needs to comply with regulations of the Feather River Air Quality Management District, which requires the landowner to submit a smoke management plan for any proposed burn greater than 10 acres and which occurs at or above a mean elevation of 1,000 feet. And this information is included in this guidance document. Next slide, please. SPR AD7 also requires that any explanations regarding implementation are submitted in the post-project implementation report for completed projects. For example, SPR Bio 12 and Mitigation Measure Bio 3A require explanations when it is infeasible to implement the stated avoidance measures for calming nesting birds and for sensitive natural communities, respectively. Some measures provide for added flexibility under certain project-specific conditions, and explanations for any deviations from the stated requirements are required. For example, mitigation measures Bio 1A and Bio 2B require an explanation for any reduction in the required buffer size for special status species. And SPR Hydro 4 requires an explanation for a reduction in the required % surface cover that should remain after treatment in a watercourse and lake protection zone in the WILPES. Next slide. So here it is helpful to include rows for these explanations right in the implementation guidance table. For example, here is mitigation measure Bio 2B to avoid impacts to non-listed special status wildlife. If you look at the last two columns, you can see there is project-specific implementation guidance for species that were detected during focus surveys. One species, the purple martin, requires a 100-foot buffer around a nest, and special status bats require a 250-foot disturbance buffer around their roost. The last column includes the checkbox for if the measure was implemented, as you've seen before, and an additional box for if a buffer was reduced. If a buffer was reduced, you need to provide a site or treatment activity specific explanation for the reduction in the next row of the table. And you can see that row is located at the bottom of the slide. So building the explanations into the table allows the project proponent to have all the information that will be required for that post-project implementation report in one place. Next slide, please. As we've been talking about, the third time you need to submit data pursuant to SPR AD7 is when your project is completed. These data are useful for the state to track the progress of total acres treated under the CalVTP and the overall progress toward increasing the pace and scale of vegetation treatment projects. It can also provide project proponents with information on nearby vegetation treatments, which may be useful, especially when preparing a PSA. There is a link to the CalVTP implementation database webpage on the Board of Forestry's CalVTP homepage. On the implementation database page, you will find information on how to submit the GIS data and other required information for completed projects. The GIS data that was submitted after the project was approved during that second submittal pursuant to SPR AD7 will then be updated with the completed data submitted after the project is implemented. And please submit the completed project information after the initial treatments are completed and then again after maintenance treatments are completed. We don't want to wait for all the maintenance treatments to occur in future years before this treatment is tracked as completed. All right, next slide. And I will hand this back over to Heather for our wrap up.
Thank you all very much for your interest in this training. I wanted to point you to some helpful resources. The CalVTP implementation website has a lot of resources, various pages with information and documents. They're listed here. Of particular note is the CalVTP program EIR, as well as various templates that we've been talking about, including for a PSA and for the findings. Next slide. And also all of the documents that are associated with the 2 example projects. The documents for each are listed here. We've also posted the tribal communication and coordination letters for each project too. So thank you again for your interest in this training and for your interest in the CalVTP. We hope that this was helpful for many agencies to use the CalVTP program EIR, and thank you for your interest in expediting delivery of projects to reduce wildfire risk and to promote landscape resiliency.